Look, thank you very much. It is a great privilege to be here with you today, and I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. We at the university are very proud that people have been teaching and learning in the Sydney Basin for tens of thousands of years, and think that all Australians should be proud with us. Well, my university is the oldest university in Australia. We pride ourselves on that, and yet I think it would be fair to say that we haven't quite known at many points in our history what exactly it means to be an Australian university and not just a European university transplanted. And that's a question that we are exploring at the moment in a number of aspects of our strategy for the university. We know why we were founded, for excellence, Sedere Mens Eodum Mutato. Our motto means, broadly speaking, we can do it as well here as anywhere else in the world, and community service. That was very clear at the beginning, excellence and community service. But what does it mean to do that here? What does it mean to do that as an Australian institution? What, I suppose, does it mean to be Australian? Well, it seems to me there are two quite different accounts of what it means to be Australian, of the Australian identity, and neither of them quite ring true. And that's important to us because we are committed to developing leaders for this community. We have a strong tradition of producing leaders in business, in civil society, in government. And we're committed to doing that well. But what does it mean to be a leader here? What does it mean to be Australian? Well, the first Prime Minister of Australia was, after all, a graduate of the University of Sydney. And the first piece of legislation of the Australian Parliament was, of course, the White Australia policy. And that's Australia, isn't it? After all, our founding mythology, the legend of the 90s, the work of Banjo Paterson, writers such as him, it's all about a lone, secular, male stockman. No room for Aboriginal Australia, no room for almost anyone else, certainly no role for women. And then there's the digger legend, the legend of the Anzacs. It's all about mateship, about men, white men doing it together. And yet it doesn't quite ring true to our history. Because the University of Sydney was also the first university in the world to be founded to admit students on the basis of academic merit alone at a time when other universities had religious and property tests. And indeed, William Charles Wentworth in the 1850s explicitly said that the University of Sydney was to be open to disciples of Muhammad, of Brahma, of Jesus, of Vishnu, that it was to be an institution that was open to the world. We weren't the first in the world to admit women, but we were arguably the first in the world to admit them on an equal basis with men. When women were admitted to the University of Sydney, they were admitted to the dissection laboratories. They were allowed to study medicine, things at the time that were considered scandalous elsewhere. So we're the Australia of the White Australia policy, but not quite. And then there's the other Australia, the Australia of multiculturalism. We're one, but we're many, and from many lands we come. And yet that doesn't ring quite true either, does it? Australia is not a multicultural society. It's a society of parallel monocultures. Look at the leadership of this country. 2 people in the Federal House of Representatives are of non-European ethnicity. Less than 2% of the executives of the ASX 200 are of East Asian, actually of Asian origin broadly considered, notwithstanding the fact that the education system has been producing extremely talented Asian students for 30 or 40 years. No people of non-European ethnicity on the Stock Exchange Board. No people on of non-European ethnicity on the Reserve Bank Board. None in directorships at most of the ASX 200. And when I talk to my own students and say, what's your experience of diversity on campus? Oh, they say incredibly diverse. You know, here's the Islamic Student Society, the Evangelical Christians, the Chinese Student Society, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender group. You say, yes, 63,000 students. I bet you can commute in and mix with people from your own subculture and commute home again. And they say, actually, it's worse than that. Our academic classes are large enough that we can make sure that we only do group work with people from our own subculture. And that in a city that is so highly ghettoized, not only by ethnicity, but by socioeconomic status, for Pete's sake, by sexual orientation. So we're one, but we are many, and from many lands we come, and yet not quite. We're at a moment in our history, I think, when it's never been more important to ask the real Australia to stand up, to know which of these Australias we are to be. The last election, with its results, demonstrates that this is the time to ask that question. And if the university is to produce leaders for Australia, we need to know which Australia we're producing leaders for. Well, the university, in its recent strategy, has made a very clear commitment to producing leaders for a different kind of Australia, to an Australian institution. Part of what we've done is to make sure that we understand what it means to live in a continent where people have been living for at least 53,000 years, if the latest fossil records, the latest bone records are right. And so we've required every department, both academic and professional, in the university to produce a plan to think about our engagement with Aboriginal Australia. But far more broadly, we're thinking about what it means to produce leaders for an Australia that is diverse as the Australia that we live in. And that's not straightforward. Universities don't do that automatically. Let's remember that perhaps the great flowering of the Western European university system happened in Weimar, Germany, just as the Nazis were at the door. It's something an institution has to do self-consciously. And so we began with a conversation about our values. We began with a conversation about the things that we thought were important in the way that we dealt with one another and in the way that we dealt with the community more generally. And again, openness and inclusion, diversity and engagement came back as values to which our staff were deeply committed. And we began to think through what that might mean, not only educationally, but also in our life together. What it might mean, for example, to do something that Australians don't do well on the whole, that is to disagree well. We're a consensus society. We love it when everybody agrees. But of course, not everybody agrees all the time. What does it mean to disagree respectfully, to listen to the other, to understand, and yet nevertheless to be able to say, I understand how you see the world, and let me explain to you why I don't agree. To engage in meaningful dialogue of that kind. That's a core intellectual skill that our students must have. And we began with that conversation of values, and we moved out to say, well, what implications does that have for our curriculum? First, we were committed to the notion that cultural competence training ought to be available and indeed at some point required of all our members of staff. That we ought to make sure that people have thought reflectively about what it means to see the world from the eyes of the other. We also thought about what it means to embed cultural competence into the curriculum, to make sure that students are developing that key intellectual skill that we need if they really are going to be leaders. For not a broadly secularized, homogenized Australia, but an Australia in which it is possible for people with genuinely different worldviews to coexist and to prosper together. Similarly, we're requiring students to take programs from an open learning environment, which will include courses in the great worldviews. One of the distressing conversations I had over the last couple of years was with the Sydney University Muslim Student Society. And I said to them, so when you talk to students on campus, beyond the 5 pillars, what do they know about Islam? Well, they guffawed. They said, no student we ever met, if they're not Islamic, knows that there are 5 pillars of Islam. And certainly no student could list them if they'd read that in Wikipedia. That's a shame. That's a damning indictment on the educational system in Australia. So one of the things we're doing is thinking about what it would mean to make that kind of basic information about the world's great intellectual and religious traditions available to students no matter what it is that they're studying. And finally, we're looking at how you develop those skills in real-world contexts. In particular, we're requiring students to engage in a process of what we're calling real-world problem solving, where we work with community organizations, putting students into multidisciplinary teams, and asking students to come up with solutions to issues that those organizations are facing as a part of their assessed course and indeed as a part of their requirement. And we're doing that not only in the university but also embedded in community settings. So for example, we'll have 800 students in Kakadu, in the Muripaki Regional Assembly area in Western New South Wales, in the Tiwi Islands, working with Indigenous communities, thinking through the particular challenges that those communities face, not as experts coming in to solve problems, but as partners with community, developing the skills to think about issues from the community's perspective and to bring their own expertise to bear. If you're going to know what it means to be a university, to be an Australian university, if you're going to know what it means to produce leaders who can think about harmony, you've got to be having a hard conversation about values. You've got to make sure that your staff are also thinking about what cultural competence might look like. You've got to make sure that information about the great worldviews, basic information, is available to your students as a whole. You've got to be making sure that cultural competence skills are embedded in all their learning. And you've finally also got to be sure that they're learning to exercise their intellectual skills in cultural contexts that challenge and extend them and require them to see the world through the eyes of the other. This project has involved us turning our whole educational offerings on their head. We're moving from 122 to 20 undergraduate degrees. But we think they will be degrees that produce leaders for a different kind of Australia. I do think we're at a crucial moment in our history as an institution when we think about what it means to remain faithful to our founding vision. Excellence and community service in a community that was identified by Wentworth at the foundation explicitly to be one of diversity. But I also think that we are at a crucial point in the history of our nation. Which Australia is going to win? Well, I applaud the work of Affinity in working with community organisations, with government and with businesses for a better Australia. For the Australia in which we genuinely can say we are one, but we are many, and from many lands we come. I'm pleased to be able to partner with Affinity in thinking through what it might mean to produce leaders who can see that happen. It doesn't happen automatically. Remember Weimar Germany. But if people of goodwill are committed to working together, then I think higher education can really make a difference. Thank you very much.